Open source is getting a test this week as MinIO and Weka have a public discussion over a licensing issue. MinIO announced late last week that Weka is misusing a license to use MinIO's open source software. MinIO had originally licensed that software under the Apache 2.0 license, but switched to using the Affero GPU 3.0 license in 2021. The AGPL restricts companies from incorporating free software into commercial products. Weka responded to MinIO's claims, stating that they were not in violation of the original Apache license agreement prior to 2021, and that they had forked the software before the license switch. MinIO has previously said that Nutanix was violating their license back in 2022. Stephen, this seems pretty complicated.
It is very complicated, and I will start by saying we are not lawyers and we are not giving a legal opinion on this story. In fact, we don't really have a dog in this hunt, except for the fact that we are friendly with both MinIO and Weka, and we frankly feel that both of them are contributing quite a lot to the enterprise tech landscape. So, as you mentioned, this story is something of a follow-up to the run-in that MinIO had with Nutanix last year, where essentially Nutanix was said to have been using MinIO's software improperly and without proper licensing and payments and so on. That should have served as a warning to the entire IT industry that MinIO is coming after you if you're using their software and you're not an official partner and an official licensee. And to be honest with you, I can see MinIO's point in this. I mean, they frankly have developed a wonderful piece of software, an object, S3 compatible object store. And in fact, from what I'm hearing, the MinIO implementation is in many ways the superior implementation out there in terms of functionality and performance and features and so on. I mean, this is really a great cloud object store. MinIO also has other components, including a client and a performance testing suite and so on. And all of these have been used by many vendors in the enterprise tech space, not just Nutanix and not just Weka. In my own conversations with MinIO, let's just say there is some negative feelings about the fact that the entire industry seems to be capitalizing on their innovation and using literally their software in ways that actually compete with MinIO in the market. And I can understand that would, get their goat. Especially when you have companies like Weka issuing performance claims that show that essentially that MinIO's software performs better than, MinIO's software in testing. And that is actually possible because of the underlying nature of the Weka system, which is actually a really, really wonderful storage platform. And so, kind of turning the page here, we look at Weka. What it looks like is it looks from the outside that Weka actually did get the memo about Nutanix and MinIO and decided, you know what, we have to use this because it's good software, but we're going to comply with the license and we're going to fork it and we're going to, stick with the Apache license part instead of the AGPL license part and moved off of it. And at least that's what Weka is saying in their defense. And they've presented some evidence that they have disclosed that it's MinIO software, that they have forked it, and they claim that they're not using any of the Apache licensed code, the AGPL licensed code, which is entirely plausible and possible. So again, we don't really have a statement or a side to take in this, except that both companies have presented a plausible case about what's going on. I think the more important aspect for our listeners is what does this mean? Well, first of all, what it means is that clearly MinIO is a great storage platform. Clearly Weka is a great storage platform, and using them together seems to work really, really well. If Weka's claims are borne out with evidence in court and all that sort of thing, I think that, from my perspective, it seems like Weka has a good case that, frankly, that they're using this stuff properly. If not, then I think that MinIO has a good case that they're using it improperly, and it's not for me to decide either way. But I think that ultimately what's going to happen here is that all of the companies in the enterprise tech space that are using MinIO software need to get right by it. If I was using MinIO anywhere in my stack, the first thing I would do is reach out to the folks at MinIO and say, hey, look, let's make a deal here. Because I know these guys, they're not unreasonable. They'll make a deal with you. They'll figure something out with you, and then you can continue to use their software probably. I would definitely do that. I guess the second thing that you should do is make sure that you're right with licensing, no matter whether it's MinIO or any other open source product. Again, no aspersions here against Weka because their claims suggest that they are right with licensing, but everybody needs to be right with it. It is really frustrating to see companies ignoring the requirements of the Apache license or the GPL, not contributing their modifications back, ignoring requests for source code. Open source software is open source software, and you've got to do the right thing with open source software, whether it's from a company like MinIO or whether it's from an open source project. There's a big case going on right now with a major, let's say, farm equipment maker that is not contributing their code back that they're using all the open source. This is wrong. And if you're going to benefit from open source, then you have to do the things that contribute back to the open source ecosystem. It's also wrong for customers. And that's the thing I'll point out here as well. One of the challenges that happens here with licensing and with open source is sometimes companies will be using this stuff in a way that is, maybe it's out of date, maybe it doesn't include the recent security patches, maybe it doesn't include new features, and that can be very harmful to customers. It is far, far better to be up to date, to include all the latest security patches, all the latest improvements and everything. Then, and in order to do that, even if you have to abide by licensing changes or licenses that you don't agree with, well, I'm sorry, you got to do that. If you're going to, and again, I don't know anything about the details of this case, but if you're going to fork software before a licensing switch, well, that means that you might be out of date in terms of bug fixes, in terms of security patches. And that's going to be challenging for you, and it's going to be challenging for you to maintain that software. And so maybe you should think about that before you start using this stuff and make sure that you have a plan to get right by licensing and to be using this stuff properly. That's all I'll say. So from a customer's perspective, if I'm going to use a product that includes any kind of open source, I want to make sure that my vendor discloses what open source they're using, properly participates in the open source ecosystem, and keeps things up to date. Because man, the problem with open source is, yes, it allows you to improve software when there are bugs and security holes found, but it also exposes those bugs and security holes to anyone who goes looking for them if they are there. So you've got to keep this stuff up to date. And that requires playing nicely in the open source ecosystem.